If you're trying to fill a glass of water but can't see or hear how full it is, how do you know when to stop pouring? In the case of the glass and the water, our perception tends to pretty closely match the physical reality of what's happening. Most of us can see or hear the glass getting full, but with voice, this can be particularly tricky because the way we perceive sound isn't measurable. If I go, most people wouldn't walk away with the immediate impression, oh, that's the sound of the vocal folds oscillating at about 400 times per second. But they might perceive, oh, that note is kinda high or kinda low, depending on whatever they're comparing it to. There's this paradigm that I see over and over again with many trans femme clients where we overestimate how much of a vocal quality we need in order to be perceived as feminine. This very frequently seems to follow a certain pipeline of sorts, and today I want to do a thorough deep dive breaking down exactly how that can happen and why. Part 1. Standard overestimation and why we do it. Most of us have gone through a significant portion of our lives believing many characteristics of male and female voices are mutually exclusive. We can start to believe that they're so fundamentally different that there's virtually no overlap in qualities like pitch range or overall timbre. This belief is what makes the concept of voice feminization or masculinization seem impossible to so many people. The author Julia Serrano has written about the idea of oppositional sexism, the prescriptive view that men and women are inherently opposed and thus must have few overlapping defining characteristics.
It isolates us from one another and exaggerates our differences. It provides the framework for us to project other opposite pairs onto female and male, and femininity and masculinity. Thus we assume that men are aggressive and women are passive, men are tough and women are weak, men are practical and women are emotional, men are big and women are small, and so on. As a culture, we regularly buy into this way of thinking, despite the fact that we all encounter countless exceptions that prove these assumptions incorrect. This idea of opposites creates expectations for femaleness/femininity and maleness/masculinity that all people are encouraged to meet, and simultaneously delegitimizes all behaviors that do not fit these ideals.
I think it's safe to say that most trans people don't directly buy into this idea, but this kind of thinking permeates a lot of society. This is the basis of gender norms that many of us are pressured to live out. Demonstrating exceptions to these oppositional gender norms can draw attention to ourselves. Many of us have direct experience with this, often from both before and in the process of transition. Because this attention is typically negative and can even be dangerous in many cases, leaning into these oppositional expectations can be a defense mechanism, a vessel of cover for more smoothly moving through the world. When we've developed an impression that male and female voices are explicitly oppositional in any way, we also foster the idea that a drastic amount of change is required to flip the gender perception of the voice we're starting with. Even if we're not particularly conscious of this idea, its shadow can color our expectations about how much we'll need to do in the process of voice training. There can be a sense of security and safety that comes from being sure that we're doing something very different with our voice as opposed to what we were doing before. And none of this is to mention dysphoria, the loving voice in our heads that incessantly echoes sometimes, we must change everything. So we overestimate. We think that in order to be perceived as cis-typically feminine, we must use higher pitches than we actually do, smaller vocal tract sizes for brighter resonances than we actually do, softer and lighter vocalizations than we actually do. The list goes on. I'm not saying that those characteristics can't be stylistic goals in voice feminization, but that's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about is the all too common scenario when I work with someone in a lesson whose only goal is to pass, yet they feel like they're doing it wrong if they exhibit anything other than the absolute ceiling of these kinds of parameters. They're the elephant in the room when we're practicing. They're the backdrop to all of our judgments about how we're doing, And they're sometimes the only metric by which we decide when to stop pouring water in the glass. All of that is to say, if you've related to anything that I've said, just watch out and try not to shy away from being critical about the standards you set for yourself. Those standards are your compass, and they warrant just as much, if not more attention than anything else you focus on in your voice journey. Part 2. Confirmation bias, reference pedestals, and minority exclusion. Let's say, hypothetically, that you did relate to anything that I said that leads to overestimation of voice features that qualify as femme. You've gathered all these ideas about how feminine voices are, and now you are primed and ready for step 2 of the pipeline. You go forth into the world and you hear voices. They're on TV, they're in the movies, they're on YouTube. Hi. They're everywhere. You hear them all the time, and you constantly file them away into cabinets in your head. The cabinets are organized. They're memory banks for groups like feminine voices, voices I like, voices I hate, voices of people I hate, voices that sound cartoony. The cataloging was probably subconscious, but if you take a second to think about any of these groups, you'll probably be able to peek into these cabinets and find, to varying degrees of resolution and accuracy, whatever you put in there. Let's go back to the first group, feminine voices. What kinds of voices do you hear when you think about that category? Who are some of the first examples to come up for you? Actually think about it for a second.
We teach girls to be brave, and we have a supportive network cheering them on. They will build incredible things. And I see this every day.
Oh boy, this is really overwhelming. Sorry, okay. And my voice is also a little gone. Whatever.
And my position is that we do not stand there and allow ourselves to be shot down and beaten. We have the right, we have the human right to defend ourselves and to defend our principles and defend what we want to do.
I just wish I could go back in time and hug that girl and let her know it's gonna be okay.
There is nothing you have to do for worth. You don't have to hustle for it. You don't have to barter for it. You have to do nothing but be born. Beautiful thought.
I'm my greatest accomplishment. Still I am. Because I love who I am, and this is how I choose to love.
Earth is like a school, and you're learning and you're growing and you're evolving, but you're also here to live and enjoy.
Mistakes are okay. And flip out only when you need to. But then really flip out. Go all out.
So there are a lot of voices in there. Obviously, hearing these voices in the first place is the basis of how we form any ideas about standards for what makes these voices feminine or masculine. But the thing is, they're not all weighted equally. It's impossible to conceptualize all that information at once. Where in the drawer we lodge those voices when we first hear them can have a lot to do with the preconceived notions I was talking about earlier because of confirmation bias. If we have the idea that feminine voices are really high or really bright or really light, when we hear a voice that matches those ideas, we're more likely to file that towards the front of the cabinet as those ideas are validated and reinforced. Yet when we hear a voice that falls outside of those expectations, we're more likely to think of them as some fringe exception to the rule rather than proof that the criteria weren't broad enough in the first place. With that mindset, they don't expand the definition of what feminine voices sound like. They just temporarily subvert it, only to be later overlooked and shoved to the back of the cabinet. This is what I call reference pedestaling and minority exclusion. And on a personal level, this kind of subconscious processing can lead to the cementing of our already overestimated voice targets. And it can make us convinced that those overestimations aren't overestimations at all. Part 3. Ceiling expansion and Overton window formation. Typically, when most people begin the process of voice feminization, they aren't able to immediately produce the voice they want to. They might not be able to comfortably speak in a high enough pitch range or with a small enough vocal tract size. In these cases, we push up against some kind of ceiling in our technical facility, and that ceiling can become a sort of reference point. If the goal is far enough away from what you were used to doing with your voice, the ceiling might have been low enough that even pushing up against it didn't yield anything close to the voice that you were aiming for. This can be extremely discouraging, despite being a very common part of the process for most of us. It takes patience and consistent effort to expand these ceilings over time, but with that time, the upper limits of our abilities can drastically improve. Here's a model for how many of us see voice training. There are these broad categorical features that contribute to gender perception, such as average pitch and weight and resonance. These kinds of features consist of diametrically opposed sound qualities: low versus high, heavy versus light, large versus small, or something along these lines. But these sound qualities aren't binary. All of them can be realized on a spectrum. Segmenting them in this way is arbitrary, but for the sake of visualization, let's number them from 1 to 10, with 1 and 10 being determined by the physical limitations of what someone could conceivably do with their voice given a maximal amount of training. Let's just say that someone beginning voice training exhibits ceilings at the following point. Their targets are likely higher than these values, especially when we consider everything that's been said about overestimation. They may internalize early on that what they're aiming for is an amount of change that's beyond the current limits of their technical facility. And it's here that the trap emerges. In that line of thinking, there's an inherent risk that the limits themselves stay the reference point forever, and therefore the goal is always something just beyond that. That may be accurate at first, but as that facility develops, the goal constantly needs to be adjusted, and this is the step out of the pipeline that I see so many people miss. Instead, they may never realize when their technical facility does evolve and eventually surpasses what they are originally aiming for, all the while aiming progressively higher. Self-perception is infamously tricky, and dysphoria tends not to do our self-confidence any favors. This is surprisingly easy to do. This leads to the end of the pipeline, the formation of a new Overton window. In its original context, the Overton window is a model from American politics described by the political scientist Joseph P. Overton. In its entirety, the model depicts how societal values can shift over time and influence political stances. But the Overton window itself refers to the range of ideas that are socially acceptable enough at a current time to be safe for a political candidate to endorse without running the risk of losing votes. The window can shift and shrink and expand around ideas based on a ton of factors, like the general public's frequency of exposure to concepts, or how often and in what light those concepts are discussed in media. Let's go back to the spectra we were talking about earlier. We work with the understanding that qualities are closer to one end of each spectrum skew a voice to being perceived as more masculine, and qualities closer to the opposite end skew more feminine. As we zero in on our targets on the feminine end of each spectrum, we inherently develop ideas about the range we need to stay within to safely fit within the societal percept of feminine. I think of this range for each quality as the trans-femme Overton windows. When our goal is to feminize our voices by broad societal standards, in our heads, voice qualities that fit within the windows feel safe, and exhibiting voice qualities outside of those windows feels risky, uncomfortable, or wrong. The problem is that we often make these windows way too small for ourselves. This is the end result of all that overestimation, the byproduct of all those social pressures, and it's the lens by which we often judge ourselves too critically and limit what our voices can become. And the worst part is that this is sometimes counterintuitive to reaching our goals because it prevents us from really understanding the nuances of what makes such a broad range of voices feminine. Significantly high average pitch ranges and resonance size configurations can be red herring. These features are only pieces of the big picture when it comes to gender in voice, but the collective whole of these and many other features is much more important than any of these features individually. And the result of this is that there are many more viable options than we sometimes conclude. There are plenty of examples that prove that voices that are relatively lower in pitch or heavier in weight or darker and larger in size can be ubiquitously perceived as feminine. If there's anything to take away from this, let it be my recommendation to inspect these Overton windows you use as your standards for what you must do with your voice. Question them specifically and ask if there's any room to expand them. This is often a late game process for many of us, yet I think this can often be one of the most liberating. Part 4, mitigation strategies. Here are some things you can do to assess these windows. Find and listen to new voices in recording. Analytically listening to recordings of other people's voices that you like can be a great step when first beginning voice training, but it can also be a great practice to revisit if you've been working on your voice for a while. YouTube is a great place to just poke around and compile a list of references. Many of us hear voices all the time in our day-to-day lives, but sitting down and really listening in a focused and detail-oriented way involves a very different headspace a lot of the time. These don't have to be people that you want to sound like specifically. This is just useful for collecting information and making observations. It can be especially helpful to make sure you have a collection of references of different demographics and regional groups. Compare a wide variety of voices that you perceive as feminine to your Overton windows, and pay close attention to whether or not every quality you can observe aligns within your standards. If one doesn't for any reason, don't dismiss it as an exception to the rule. Consider that it may be proof that the rules aren't broad enough. Listen to recordings of yourself. Listen just as attentively as you do to the reference recordings, and make mental notes about how the qualities of your voice compare to those in those references. Try your best to avoid qualifying your voice or any elements of it as good or bad, and try to be as objective as you possibly can about the qualities that you notice. For some people that have a hard time with this, playing recordings of themselves backwards can help remove some degree of negative bias. Talk to people about this. It can be really easy to lose perspective by yourself. Just talking about this whole premise with others that you trust, especially those who are going through the same process, can be incredibly helpful and even healing in some cases. You are not alone, and leveraging community and support systems wherever you can be just as important as any other part of voice training. If you have any thoughts about any of this, please feel free to share them in the comments. We would love to hear them. Thank you so much for watching and for all of your continued support. Check out our offerings for lessons and classes, including a brand new singing feminization group class at TransVoiceLessons.com, and please consider supporting us on Patreon for exclusive content. Like and comment if you have thoughts, and we will see you in the next video. Bye!